Okay, let's get started. So today, as always, I have a rather ambitious program. So let's see what happens to my ambitions. But what I want to do is have this fall in two separate parts. We're going to finish this analysis of what I call Newtonian demand. And in particular, I'm going to talk about the principle of relativity and how it applies to the quantity demanded, but also to the wants. Right? So we'll talk a little bit about a difference that is very apparent between the way engineering is done, using a lot of vector analysis, matrices, vectors that are pointing ways, and economics that doesn't use any of these things. Then I'd like to move on to something that's called Galilean relativity. This is the regular sort of relativity that belongs to Newtonian mechanics, as opposed to the kind of relativity that Einstein introduced. It builds on this. Then I want to, because of several students who are doing their thesis topics, they're finding thesis topics, I want to talk about two extra things. One, capital versus consumer goods. This relates to work that Joris is doing, and there's a lot of misunderstandings about it, and I want to clear it up in the context of this Newtonian demand. And I also want to talk a little bit about credits and debits and banking and how this relates to vector analysis and the principle of relativity. All right? So that as far as Newtonian demand is concerned, price. And then with the time that's left over, we're going to go and launch ourselves into this idea of energy, or what is known as the economic surplus. So we'll talk a little bit about Leibniz versus Newton. There was a controversy at the time of different interpretations of force. Leibniz saw force as something that does work, and Newton saw force as something that changes momentum. How do these things relate? How was this resolved? And what impact does this have for economics? How can we interpret this in economics? All right? So we'll talk about work and show how it relates to benefits. We'll introduce power and how it relates to economic activity. And then finally introduce surplus as it relates to our notion of kinetic energy. All right? So this is just our first foray into this, just to lay down the ideas, and the lectures after this lecture we'll go in depth on this notion of energy. All right? Probably only one lecture at most, and then we can start moving to springs and dampers and other elements. Okay. For some reason. So how do I get this? I never know this. Okay, thanks. All right. So the first thing, let's just go back and say we've done a lot of work on Newtonian, but we still haven't really answered this one question. Is like, if we think about Newtonian mechanics, we have one relationship, P is m times v. That's the definition of momentum. And we can look at F is m times a, this relationship, as being a movement along this, the definition, the curve that represents the definition of momentum. But the thing you have to see is there's only one curve with only one slope, which is the mass, which is a number greater than 0. All right? Now, we go to the situation in economics. We have two things. We have apparently a supply curve. Then we have a demand curve that slopes downward as opposed to upwards. Okay? So the more you're getting, the less you're gonna, value is, and the lower the price. The more you have to supply, the higher you'll up your price. All right? So this seems to be something like a negative mass or something. What is that? Now, in Newtonian mechanics, a negative mass cannot occur. If you have a negative mass, things are going to go crazy. Because if you look at F is m times a, a negative mass would mean that by reducing the force, you can get acceleration. So that's not going to work. all right? What you can do is make all masses negative and then choose the force just to go in a different direction. You can do that, right? And in fact, that would have been a little bit nicer because then you see that the momentum flows opposite to the velocity. You see here, momentum and velocity all point in the same direction. But that's the way Huygens did it, so we're stuck with that. So we're gonna have to take this positive mass situation and translate that to economics. It's a little bit of a squeaky point here because the most intuitive one curve is this demand curve, and it's got a negative slope. So the elasticity, yes?
Why would it be nicer if momentum and velocity would not point in the same direction? Because it seems counterintuitive that you would find that better.
Okay, because what I feel is that velocity and force are conjugate variables, right? So that product of the two, which is power, you want to keep constant, right? All right, so when you up one, the other has to go down, as it were, right? So force is the price you have to pay for increasing velocity. So the price goes the other way, in a sense. And so it does in economics. So you want to buy more goods, the value, the price you got to pay will flow the other way. Of course, negative price will flow that way, all right? So what we'll see, so in that sense, it would be, it will be better, right? So you would see the conjugacy, and it's called duality in mathematics, where you keep a product constant, one goes up, the other would go down, all right?
That not down smaller being closer to 0 sense, then it... Yeah,
it will be down in the inverse sense, right? But I'm just giving you this intuition, right? Why you talk about a force opposing it, So, look, in mechanics, what does it matter, right? I mean, it just means how is the momentum flowing? Is the momentum flowing from the gravity into the mass or from the mass into gravity? I mean, it all depends on how you see the flow of momentum, all right? It doesn't really matter. For me personally, I feel, okay, something flows one way, something else should flow the other way to counterbalance it, but what does it matter? Huh? But we'll see that in economics, and I want to go through this, especially because of Britt's work in ALM, asset and liability management, that we can think of the flow of momentum as the flow of credit going to a debit. So you can think of credits and debits as a flow of value going from a credit to a debit, but you can think of it the other way around too, But usually accountants will think of credit as the source. Well, we'll get to this, all right? But the short answer, Ozai, is in mechanics, it doesn't really matter, all right? And in economics also, it doesn't really matter. It's just a choice. But unfortunately, the choice made in economics tends to be opposite of the choice made in mechanics. So we just have to learn to deal with that. But the choice made in this supply line is fine. It's just the demand line that's screwing up. Did that answer your question, Jose?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Maybe it was a long answer and not very satisfactory. Huh?
Yes, but I'm used to those.
Anyway, look, the thing, you see, economists, here's the problem. Like, what they do is they say, here's the quantity demanded, so it goes down, and then the quantity supplied, they run the other way, right? Okay, so maybe I should make that blue. I just run that the other way. But they don't run this thing the other way. You would want to run this thing the other way too, right? But they don't do that. So they get this graph that is You know, that it's a little bit silly. It's a little bit the same mistake that Descartes make when you think of momentum as just a positive quantity like energy is, but it isn't. Huh? It is a vector, actually a covector. Now let's go to the details and just sort this out. So I think the answer to Ozai's question is, look, you can do both. It's just that these guys do that and these guys do that, and we all have to get everything into the terms of the mechanics, okay? Because that's our program. So this is a busy slide. I want to step through this slide. This is supposed to resolve all these issues. All right? So here is one mass, and here's a wall. So this would be like an Edgewood box, and here I put another wall here, so this will be the extent. It will slam against here, but let's assume that that doesn't happen during our analysis. Huh? And then this mass here has some velocity, and the wall here has its own velocity. And we'll just assume that the wall is going at 0. So what are we? We're the observer, and we're just standing here, right? Huh? Just looking out at what's going on. Now we're sitting on this wall. Okay? This thing here is the buyer. This is the market. Huh? Now this will be the agent. So the market is this humongous mass. We talked about that, how you can put all kinds of inertias together and look at the center of mass. So we'll just assume this is a huge market, all kinds of individual players that have sorted each other out. All right? And we're looking at the seller here as part of the market. All right? So we'll just assume that our velocity is 0. Then clearly what we're going to see is that the velocity of this mass here is the difference between its velocity, the velocity of the agent, minus the market. Okay? That's what we're going to observe. All right? And so it is in economics. Like, we are the market where there's some demand that we're having. I mean, maybe this is 50, right? And then we're just ambling along, you know, in economic equilibrium as a whole market. We don't really care, you know, that we're using all this oxygen or all this water or whatever it is we're using. But all we see is that somebody is going at 50 plus this VA, all right? That's all we see, all right? So
we actually only see the VA, right? Because we have a demand of 50, so we don't.
Yeah, so we see this difference is what we see, yeah. Right? Huh? But somebody standing not here on here, but standing out here, say God or somebody, right? He sees us going at 50, and he sees this guy is going at 50 plus VA, right? Huh? And we see this. Thank you, Ozai. Yes. All right? So what you do is, what is velocity? That's what the principle of relativity says. You can only really see a difference in velocity, okay? So in this case, you're here, you're going to see this difference. And this guy, maybe he's going with some other V star star, huh? And he will see the differences with his. It will make no difference, okay? So the only thing we notice is difference in velocity. So you cannot determine what absolute velocity you're going. This is the principle of relativity, all right? Now, the first thing to note is that so it is in demand. So the quantity demanded is always with respect to another person. So this is the party. The only way you can figure out what it is looking at a counterparty, all right? And then look at the difference. So suppose this guy is going at a huge speed, and this one a small one, then this will be the demander, and this will be the supplier, right? Because this difference will be negative, okay? So if this is going at a huge speed, and this guy at a small speed, then this one, relative to the wall, is going that way, all right? Okay? So the principle of relativity, what it tells us is that demand is a relative thing. You can turn a demander into a supplier if you compare him to somebody else, all right? And the reason why this is the case is because of the way Marshall formulated it. He says price is only dependent on the quantity demanded, the velocity. Now, this velocity has to be relative. So, and in fact, if you look at this, where are the units, right? There are no units anywhere here, right? It doesn't say there's no zero. So nobody is saying this could be a zero. That zero could be anywhere, right? So by drawing these things like this, they basically assume that the principle of relativity applies to the quantity demanded, all right? Now, the way you usually indicate these things in engineering diagrams is you look at two terminals. So there's a terminal here, there's a terminal there, and then you look at the difference between the velocities of these two terminals, and that's what you call a cross variable. All right? So it's a little bit, you see, these across, velocity for a mechanical engineer is a cross variable. You need two terminals and you look at the difference between the two. For an electrical engineer, it's quite different. You have two terminals, and if you want to look at the current through something, it's a through variable, right? It's a slightly different field. Okay, now you would think that a flow of goods is a through variable. But if you take this type of picture, it's not. It's an across variable. It's a difference between two quantities, okay? Now, why does this all work out? Now, suppose that you have, so Newton knew all this. So when he wrote down his law, F is m times A, which he didn't write down, but when you conclude that, you can see that what is this A? That's dV dt. And that is dV minus any constant dt, if this is a constant. So it doesn't matter, right? So the thing you would want is if you have a law that is valid in all situations, that if you're going at a different speed, that not all of a sudden your law is not valid anymore and you need different mechanics, because then your mechanics will suck. Because you don't even know at what speed you're going. That's what Galileo tells you. So it better be that the laws of nature are invariant and there are things you can change arbitrarily. Otherwise, it will be a mess. It's not a law. All right? But you see how important it is that the force relates to the acceleration, not to the velocity, as Aristotle thought and a lot of other people. It wouldn't be invariant. The laws of nature would change all the time, dependent on when you're in your car or whether you're standing on, your house, or, you don't want that. Okay? Now, if you look at the law of demand, it says the same thing, as we've shown. So if the law of demand is valid, in any situation, it better be that you have the principle of relativity, because otherwise it will keep changing. All right? So this is important. In the history, it was first Galileo who posited this as a basic principle, and he had some arguments. He was in a ship, and he noticed that the bird flying around in the captain's cabin didn't even notice how fast the ship was going, and the mosquitoes neither. So this has to be a law of nature. And then Newton builds on this and shows that if you follow my laws, yes, then this principle will just fall out. Okay? And similarly, you have to see that if you take the law of demand as given in economics and you interpret it in the way I'm doing, then the law of relativity is going to fall out. That demand and supply is relative. You can be a demander or a supplier dependent on what the counterparty does. All right? Okay? The other thing to notice is that the quantity demanded in this kind of applications is an across variable. So you have two terminals and you look at the difference, okay? So there's a vector can be added or subtracted from another vector, right? And this is why you need vectors here. Okay? So you take advantage of the ability to add or subtract vectors, that there are linear elements, that you can superimpose them. Huh? Okay? Okay, so that's number one. Now, let's first go on. Let's first go on, and then I want to come back to this business here. Okay, so now we know that what we want to look at is not the demand as an absolute number, but the demand as a relative number. In economics, that's called the excess demand. So that there's demand in excess of another thing. You can also talk about excess supply if it's a negative number. All right? So that's what we really do. This is oversupply. I prefer to call this excess supply. This is better. Who says that it's over? You know, that's only when you add a spring to it. All right, so you would say, well, there's market demand this, and then the excess supply would be that, and the excess demand function would just be the negative, would be V star minus V. That would be the excess demand. All right? So here will be the picture. This is the market demand, and then this is the excess supply, and this will be the excess demand, right? Huh? All right. Now here you immediately see how you solve this thing. All you have to do is flip around this axis, right? And you're going to move it down a little bit, huh? You just sort it out, huh? And then, you know, you can see that if you are sure that you flip this thing, pop, then flip it twice, you'll get over here. All right? So that's number one. And the second thing you can do now is say, well, I'm going to arbitrarily choose some point of zero, and that point of zero is precisely this this market demand here. So I'm going to call this 0. All right? That's just a choice. That's a choice we always make. You know, if you're standing on Earth, and I'm standing on Earth, and I'm looking, there's Roomer here, there's Kuhn there, and they're going at 0 velocity, according to me. Now I'm walking. From my perspective, they're floating back in this way. From my perspective, they're floating this way. All right, so I take my velocity as 0. It isn't. I know I'm walking. You know, now what? Huh? Doesn't really matter. If I didn't know that, I'm sitting in a train, and they were in another train opposed to me at the railroad station, I wouldn't know the difference. All right, because I wouldn't be using my muscles to keep the motion up. Okay? So you see how we can straighten this out, but moreover, we can take some arbitrary point of 0 from which we call it demand and from which we call it supply, okay? So the price can be both positive and negative, all right? This is sometimes called the price spread, huh? So the price is over market or under market, and we take the market price as being 0. This is what Adam Smith called the natural price. If you read his Wealth of Nations, he has this idea that there's a natural price where there is some kind of market equilibrium. So the idea is that the quantity demanded of the agent is exactly equal to the market demand, in which case it's equilibrium. In other theories, this is called the expected price. We'll talk about that later when we do commodity markets and contango. Huh? You can also think of this as the average price, because in contango, the thing goes up and down. Oh, God, I forgot to turn off my phone. Oh, shut up.
Max,
ja. Ja.
Als de slope van de supply line en de demand line niet gelijk zijn,
Yeah.
Dan moet je die samenvoegen, zeg maar? Of hoe...
No, it's just another guy. So suppose they're not the same. These are just two masses, okay? I mean, maybe, so maybe it's better to, I took one mass and two situations, but maybe it would be better to get rid of this and think of this as masses going this way, all right? Okay?
Yeah, but then they can have different momenta or not?
Yeah, sure. This thing, look, you'll just have a situation here where one goes like that, and this will be when it's a supplier, and this is a demander, and the other goes like this, and here this one is the supplier 1, supplier 2, demander 1, demander 2. There are just two masses. You see? This is, when I draw here's three masses. This is the wall. This is M1, and this is M2. Okay? Every line is its own mass in Newtonian mechanics. In economics, every line is its own demander. It's its own, demander, okay? And inertia is demand, okay? Here is demand. A different inertia is different demand, has its own line, okay? So here I was just having this wall, and then I was imagining this thing either doing the blue thing or doing the red thing, and maybe that was a little sloppy, right? You see? So just think this away, make a blue, make this a blue one and this a red one, right? Okay? In a previous picture, you will see I had two, and then I decided, it's too complicated. Is that clear? Because that's a confusion that happens a lot, that people actually think this is one mass and that's either doing supply or demand. That may be true, but then, then you're imagining two situations, right? But in principle, every mass is a location of demand, all right? Everybody's got his own line. And this whole business of going through some center, that makes, why would that be the case in reality? That would only be the case if this were the market and both of them are going at market rate, which is the case they often consider. But there's no reason that these things should be connected to this market here or this. They can just be flying all over the place, and the one is over here and the one is over there. You don't even know where, Okay. All right. Is that clear, Wouter?
Yeah, still. So when they have the same price, when there's equilibrium?
Yeah, because they're both zero at that point, right? When you have two masses and they're in equilibrium with the Earth, say, the wall,
Yeah.
What does that mean? They're going at the same speed, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So that speed is zero, therefore the momentum will be zero, right? And the kinetic energy will be zero, right? Okay? So the thing is, like economists, they like to think of momentum as, prices being the indicator of equilibrium, but it isn't. Only when the prices are zero, right? I mean, when they're all going at not zero, but going at the market rate, because they're looking at a static equilibrium, okay?
Yeah, so just going back to slide 2, because the picture there explains. Because when you flipped around the demand curve and put it on the third quadrant, you immediately see that the equilibrium is at the origin. On the right side, you see that on the origin, that's where the equilibrium is, and then the red line can be at whatever angle you want, and the blue line as well, but only in the middle is the equilibrium.
Yeah, so the red line could be this thing, and the blue line could be, can go like that, right? Yeah. Sure. I just took here a hypothetical situation where you have one mass that is either going that speed or that speed or that speed, you know, and when the speed is negative, it is in demand, and you know, when it's positive, it's in supply. And, you know, that's all I did here, right? So I'm imagining all these different situations with one mass, right?
Yeah, and even as a different diodes, resistors that are not isomorphic.
Whatever you want. I mean, you're going to have two masses, you know? Every mass, every demand has got its own inertia. If you find things that are different, you just have a collection of them, and maybe they're all connected with some spring, and then first you measure this, but then this other one starts acting, you know, who knows? The point to see is, look, price equilibrium only works in final market equilibrium. Otherwise, you have to look at a balance of forces, not of momenta, okay? Now, the economists are always looking at final limiting equilibrium, you know, when everything is going at the same speed, right? Huh? That's just not, what's the dynamics there, right? Huh? Okay, so everything is going at zero speed, right? Or whatever that reference speed is, or that inertial reference point, and then sure, everything is 0, or 5, or whatever you call it. Huh? Okay? So if you find lines that do like this, you just got to rig up a system where one mass starts pushing back and another starts pushing back, or this or that, you know, like who was saying, you put a diode there, you put this there. You have to rig up some system, but ultimately you come back every time there's one mass doing one thing, and that's its thing. It's just this linear relationship, okay? Now we go to this whole rigmarole. Why? Because we need to get it in this form that P is equal to mv, not plus P0 here or whatever, you know. It can't be an affine transformation. It has to be linear. We need linear systems, you know. Now, we're not going to get linear systems if we add some offset and all this stuff, you know? Huh? All right? These are good questions because this principle of relativity, it all sounds so obvious, but once you start looking, you get all confused again, you know? Huh? I mean, I see you smiling behind your...
We started this, it sounded very logical, and then I started thinking about it, and then I got all messed up.
Yeah, that's what happens.
That's exactly what you said.
Yeah, it's exactly what I said. But you know, that's the thing. When Galileo came with his principle, it all sounded logical, and you could see it. But when people started thinking about it, they got really confused. They said, "But that can't be," you know. And what about this? And what about that? Right? Huh? Seriously, you know, they were going to burn the guy at the stake. He had to recant it. And they made him recant it. They brought him to some torture chamber and they showed him what they were going to do with him. Then he said, no, okay, it's all wrong what I said. And then he was allowed to go. You know? But you can see how the Catholic Church was confused. They got angry. Huh? But yet the guy was right, you know? And it's also so important to see why Newton's law is so important here, that it depends only on the acceleration, right? Because if it didn't, then what? What happened to your principle of indifference? The whole thing will be in the crapper, right? You can't call it a law. But yeah, so the feeling you have is the correct one. All of this, and this is especially important for the new students on the block, is when you hear it, it all is obvious, all right? And then when you have to do it, you find out like, oh my God, you know, and this and that, and then you struggle, and finally you figure it out. And then you think to yourself, why was this so hard for me, you know? And then you look around and you see a new guy coming along and he can't figure it out either. And you go, look, I mean, sure. Huh? So, but then you can't see it but that way. You know, at a certain point you get yourself convinced, and then you just kind of go, it becomes a little bit weird that you would actually be confused about this. But it takes a bit, you know. This is the hard part of this subject, you know. It's in these subtleties, you know. This is the hard part of Newtonian mechanics. I mean, you write this down. You go by, okay, this is like 1, 2, 3 variables, one multiplication and one equal sign. Like, how hard is this business, right? You know, Further questions?
I had another.
Yeah.
So, saying the market that and I think about it from the perspective of just company buying a certain, they won't be, they'll only be supplying. How does this apply to certain situations?
Yeah, so you take a reference point where you know what 0 is, right? Huh? Okay, and then you know this one always has to be a supplier, you know? So you got to choose your reference points correctly, okay?
And also you haven't really modeled production, but even hypothetically, let's say Voltis, they have an order for some ester, they cannot produce it, but they can buy it else and sell it for more.
You take two markets.
No, they buy it first and they sell it later.
Why would a customer the end Voltis price that Voltis them even else can get a lower higher? Why?
Yeah,
do it directly.
That's only if you assume that the customer doesn't have all information. It doesn't have to be the case.
You know, suppose you live in a society where you just breathe so much air a day and other guys breathe half the time, right? Huh? Well, what is then the demand for air? You know, you gotta take like the neutral situation, and then you are short or you're going long, or you know, huh? You know, this is what you do, and then you don't really worry yourself too much about you know what this 0 is. All right. No. Yeah, so, yes, so why is Valters a supplier? Because there is somebody else called a demander to which they're selling. That's the only reason that you can identify them as a supplier, right? Otherwise, what would they be? Yeah, I mean, they'll be on their abandoned island, you know, spitting out CO2 or whatever a human being does, right? Huh? And then whatever, I mean, would there be demand for CO2? Would there be a plant? Oh, maybe there'll be a plant there, right? Okay, but maybe somebody else will be also spitting it out, and then that's it, you know? You just get the amount of CO2 is just increasing in the world, you know? There's no demand for it, you know? So that's okay. So every time you say supplier, you mean there must be a demander to which relatively it's a supplier. That's what you're trying to say. Otherwise, the terms have no sense. So it's what you call an across variable, all right? Huh? So if I just, it's the same with the velocity. If I just going at this velocity, but there are no other particles in the universe, then what's the point of making that statement? So if I'm just Valtris, but I have no customer, then what's the point of saying that I'm producing anything?
Of course.
That's the point. And now you've answered your question. Because you find that you're going at a speed such that everybody else is going at a lower speed except your competitors, okay, who may be going even faster. And then you could sell to the competitor, sure, and they do. Sometimes. In the oil industry, they do. But you could. So you got to see what is the buyer and the seller, you know. It's relative, okay?
Yeah, I was confused by the terminology. I had it, the demand goes one way, supply goes the other way. I was looking at the graph, imagining that 0 point was the extreme point, and either you go the top right of that, so flowing up or going the other way, and it flow one or the other way. But I was looking at it in an absolute way, and not
Yeah.
Relative.
Yeah.
That's the terminology.
Yeah, so, okay, but here you identify, it's very important, the mistake you make. You were looking at an absolute way. That's what Newton tried to do. But he failed. And later people say, well, there is no such thing as an absolute way. You know? You just imagine an inertial reference frame that's this thing that's going at a particular speed, right? So and you look at relative to that, right? Okay? That's modern Newtonian mechanics, okay? That's the principle of relativity on which Einstein then builds further, all right? He assumes this principle, by the way. He doesn't junk it. For him, velocities are also relative, okay? So that's what you got to see. There is no party without a counterparty. You can't characterize who you are if you don't have somebody else. You know now, huh? Okay? That's why it's called an across variable, all right? You need these two terminals to even determine what the thing is, huh? That's why vectors, the only thing a vector really is good for is being added or subtracted to another vector. It's not the only thing it's good for, by the way. But strictly speaking, yes. It's a linear element that can be added and multiplied, okay? And that's why people use vectors for velocity, because you can subtract the two and you can find out, I mean, what is A? That's dv dt, right? Which is v1, v2 minus v1 divided by delta t, right? So you see, all you can do is look at differences. That's all you can do, okay? So demand is relative. It's something you just got to see. So this principle is one of these nasty things that sounds totally trivial, and once you think it through, you go like, oh my God, how many misconceptions do I have in my head? Huh? All right. Any further questions on this? No, good. So I want to move on to the second thing you can do with vectors. Vectors actually have something that are called also covectors. So vectors can be added and subtracted, and that's this kind of across thing, okay? But you can also see a vector as pointing along a rate of flow, as a motion, all right? So you have some path, and you add the vector here, and you follow that, all right? So the vector, in the one hand, is something that can be added and subtracted. That's what you learn in your vector analysis courses. But there are also courses, fluid mechanics, where the vector is actually a thing that's dragging along, right? Okay, that's pointing in the direction of the flow, and here'll be another vector, okay? All right? And as these vectors get closer, you'll get a little tube, you know, and in that tube is like a unit amount of stuff that is flowing, right? Now, interestingly enough, that is the perspective taken on the analog to velocity in electrical engineering. So they take a flow perspective for a vector. So they see charges flowing through, all right? They don't see current as being relative. So they take this other perspective. In mechanics, that perspective is instead taken by force, okay? So we see force as a flow of momentum. All right? So it's what we call a through variable. And a cross variable in electrical engineering will be a voltage. So you look at some element, and you take these two terminals, and you put your voltage meter, and then across that you will see the voltage, right? So they switch the roles, okay? Now in economics, you can do either. You can think of goods as flowing, but you can also, demand and supply is better seen not in that way. With a C element, yes, but with an I element, it's better seen as being an across variable, all right? In what we just discussed, in the excess demand and excess supply, all right? Those are across variable concepts. And the money is seen as a flow variable, so a through variable. And let me can you hear me? Good. Now, in mechanics again, we know exactly what goes on here. So suppose this is the positive direction, right? So this is the positive direction for this plane. So this will be the positive direction of the force, all right? So in order to, you could put a force on this mass here, and the positive direction will be this way, and you will get an acceleration, that will change this velocity, okay? Now there's got to be a reaction force, so there it is, boink, huh? Right? This is the reaction force to this action, right? All right? Or you can change it the other way around, huh? This will be the action force, and this will be the reaction force. It's probably more, all right? So that is the force that's coming either through gravity or some other way from this wall here, right? So if gravity is, well, in this case, gravity will be pushing it away. So it will be gravity coming from that wall, right? But you can also imagine some big rod here, green rod, and it's just pushing. Somebody's pushing here. So I brace myself against the wall and I push, you away, right? Okay. So here again, so I'll be pushing you here, and here'll be another action-reaction pair, right? And that's moving the momentum into the wall, right? Okay. So the momentum, this is a negative number, so you can think of, well, you can think of the momentum moving from here into there, all right? Because it's being attracted here, whatever. I mean, how does the momentum move? It probably moves the other way around, but our price will move. Okay? Now, how does that relate to economics, and with bookkeeping in particular? Well, we know that action and reaction are debit and credit pairs, right? So what's happening here? This is a seller. This is a net seller. It's going faster. So when it sells something, it's going to get some money, right? It's going to make a sale. And what do you do when you're doing bookkeeping and you make a sale? You will credit your revenue account, okay? So you credit your revenue, right? So you credit this revenue account called sales. Right? But every credit needs a debit. So what will you do? You will debit your cash account. So that's an asset. And this is, the revenue is an equity or liability account. So your cash will go up after you make your sale, and your revenue will also go up, and this will be credited and that will be debited. All right? So you can see if this seller were to keep his books, you would see that the action and reaction pair were precisely the two bookings that would have to be made to accomplish the sale that accompanies this supply to the market. All right? But the market is keeping its own books. So the market is receiving it has to pay the cash it's purchasing, right? So it has to credit, let's reduce its asset cash. All right? But at the same time, it's got to debit something. So it's got to increase the inventory of the amount of goods it has. So this is another asset. All right? So here you see totally analogously how these how action-reaction pairs correspond to the bookings that a seller and a buyer would make. All right? You can also see that the cash flow that's going through this pipe here, which I'll call the bank And I'll talk about that in a minute. Whereas the seller is receiving the cash, that means he's debiting this asset, you know. The buyer has to pony up the cash, so he has to credit it, okay? So from the perspective of the buyer, things are quite different than from the seller, all right? Now, what is cash? You can ask yourself, I don't know what that is. Maybe it's cash on hand. There's these coins that I have. I'm just moving these coins up and down. Now, what are those? You know, there's the head of the emperor, the Roman emperor on it. So he is saying this coin is worth something. What you do nowadays is you put a bank in there. So you put some kind of guy who's doing this pushing, you know, and he will have also a force here, and then a reaction force, and then this one, and another reaction force. So this will be your debit cash or receive cash. So at the bank, we'll credit your account here, okay? All right, this will be the credit for your account. If you receive cash, in your books, you debit the cash, so your asset goes up, but for the bank, it's a liability. So they will credit your account, right? Now, the opposite will happen here with the buyer, right? The buyer's got to pony up the money, so they'll debit his account. All right? And yet again, these things are balancing. Okay? So this is interesting. This tells you that the bank here is like the rod or whatever the thing is that's pushing, that's conducting the force. Okay? It doesn't go through thin air. It could, you know. Just you make some phone calls and you say, well, I agree this with you and I agree, you know, you can make it up among each other. And people do. You know, there was a case where in Ireland the banks went on strike and people just started sending each other checks, you know, and in other economies. We'll talk about this a little later. But a bank is just a formal way for transmitting this, okay? So here you can see that the price, you know, as a total amount of credit or debit that you accumulate is a flow variable. You know, it flows through something. You know, it's a value or a flow of financial resources flowing from credit to debit, from credit to debit, right? So the source is the credit, and then the destination will be the debit, okay? Just like you can think of momentum, and momentum flows the other way around, I think. Huh? So you would think of the momentum flowing this way, and then the price, the value flowing that way, all right? So this is the way Newton thinks of force, as a flux. Flux is just a Latin word for momentum, for flow, all right? So he thinks of it this way, as flowing through. And so we can think of momentum as value, economic value, in the sense of value added. It's the financial resources or the funds that are flowing from a credit location to a debit location, all right? Now, these terms, debit and credit, they're a little confusing. So I want to, before the break, just talk about where they come from so you can have a good way of interpreting this, okay? So here are two pictures, and this is a slide, this is a small business of the banking industry. So here are two pictures. On the left, you see the trade network in Europe as it was like in the late Middle Ages, like the 13th century, 12th century, 13th century, 14th century. And what you see here, all these red things, these are the Roman roads. So the Romans went ahead and built all these roads, and they did that to move their troops, their legions, from one place to another, all right? Now, but the Roman Empire quickly realized that they could make a lot of money, not by transporting legions, but by having merchants transport along these roads and charging them a toll for using the road, all right? So this was a trade network that was established in Europe, and also at the time ships were a little better, so they also established all these trade routes, and the Romans had this too, by the way, hugging along the coast here, all right? So the Romans brought these roads where they could transport the goods and the services and the goods in, not the services, also the services, you could transport slaves or other people the Romans transported, but that was canceled in the Middle Ages. So the goods could be easily transported. A problem they had, okay, so the physical resources was no problem. It wasn't no problem. It was a problem, but it was well resolved. The problem they had was the financial resources, the credit and the debit, was very cumbersome. So the Roman Empire always suffered from a lack of specie. Specie is the physical money. So they used mostly silver. In the beginning of the Republic, mostly bronze. And there was never enough of it. They had some silver mines over in Austria, and there was never enough of it. You know? Secondly, transporting this was a major hazardous undertaking. Look, your goods, what is people going to do with 10 million gallons of olive oil? But when you can get some gold or silver, that's a nice cash. So it's very dangerous to transport, okay? And this hampered a lot of trade, especially in the Roman Empire, all right? And especially when the Roman Empire fell and the roads were not going to be very safe anymore because the legions were not protecting them. Then a huge innovation occurred in Florence and around the 12th century. And that was the emergence of banking. So the banking started with money changers. So you have the idea of the medieval money changers. You see these pictures. They have a green cloth for them, and they're dressed very nicely, and they sit and count this money. Because in Europe at the time, there were all these different types of money. There was gold florins from here, and this from there, and this from there, all kinds of things, and these had to be changed. Now, what these money changers did at a certain point, they had a bench, by the way. And in Florence, you had a right to go money change and have your bench outside. This is where the word bank comes from. Huh? Is in Dutch, a bench is a bank also. Huh? So it's the bench at which you can sit. Huh? So these money changers had all this money, and they're counting this and that. But at a certain point, they got tired of that, and the customers got tired of it. So what they preferred to do was you brought your money at the money changer, and he just kept it in storage. And then he gave you a note that you had this much money at his place. All right? And that was a letter of credit. So you could go with that note, and it wasn't transferable. So if somebody stole that note, there's totally no value to him. And with that note, you went to Augsburg or Amsterdam or wherever you went, and then you handed over that note, and you got the goods. And these notes could be settled at a local representative of this money changer. All right? So now you solve a lot of stuff. So you don't have to carry all this, first of all, you don't have to carry all this specie along, right? Now, some guys started this, and the most famous family that started this is the Medici. So they started these banks. So here you see these little things. Those are banking centers. So they were in Florence, and Florence used something called the Florentine golden coin. That's the origin of our word guilder, or florin, FL, it was the use in Holland of these letters of credit coming from Florence, and they were used here, all the way here, as currency, okay? Now then, another step happened. So what happened was people started moving these letters of credit around. So you could transfer ownership. So when you did a deal, you say, okay, here's your letter of credit, and I sign off that it's now yours, all right? So this guy could go back to Florence or to another branch of the Medici Bank over here and get his gold, but he didn't want that because he wants to use it for something else. So quickly, these things became the currency, not the gold, okay? And it said on them, here's a note that represents so many Florentine pieces of gold, so many guilders, or so many florins. Huh? All right? And then quickly, these guys, they realized, what's the point of, you need to have some gold, but most of the time the stuff doesn't even get, extracted anymore, right? So I can just give you a letter of credit, and then that's good enough, all right? And they would be not so keen to do that too much, because then you'll get a run on the bank. But later in the Netherlands and also in Sweden, they decided that this was not necessary anymore. So then you get something like fractional reserve banking, and all you do is move these little notes around, okay? And now you solve the problem. Because now you have your trade network for the movement of financial or for physical resources. That's all your ships and your roads. But now you have another network for moving the financial resources around. And that's all these letters of credit from the Medici Bank. There was a big competitor, the Fugas, others, and those ones allow for the motion of momentum, okay, or price or economic value, all right? And then you're off to the races, because letters of credit can be moved instantaneously, all right? Whereas the goods would take some while, but you could settle it almost instantaneously. It's the speed of information. What I wanted to do today was get that Newton's cradle we had, right? And we don't have it, and we haven't fixed it. But you know what these things are. You have these little balls, and you take one and you hit it, and then the momentum will fly, and the other ball will fly off on the other end. You guys know this thing? Huh? Anyway, what's happening there is one of these balls has momentum, and it hits the 5 or 6 balls. The momentum flows like there's no tomorrow. I know the speed, it flies at the speed of light through there, right? A little bit below, because these shock waves go a little bit slower than the speed of light. And the other hand, it comes out, and the thing takes off. This is banking, okay? Right? This is banking. So the credit comes in, boom, and the debit comes out the other end. And you get the recoil, comes out the other end, right? As if you shoot a gun, right? So the bullet goes out, and you get the recoil, right? Debit and the credit. But rather than moving it really slowly with your hand, all of a sudden you can move it like there's no tomorrow by hitting a piece of metal, and the force will just flow through, all right? And this is what banking does, right? Now with our internet and stuff, what then happened, let's just finish the history, you know, in the Industrial Revolution, this road network was considered completely inadequate. Okay, well, first in the age of exploration, the networks over sea were considered inadequate. And actually, the Netherlands played a very important role in expanding this over to the Americas and India. So all these blue lines. But they needed money to go each way too. So those VOC ships usually would be laden with silver. That was all they would take to China and come the other way back. Huh? And this was not working, so that's when they started messing with banking in Amsterdam. All right? And they started making this easier and easier. They don't have to transport all this silver around. All right? So part of these Batavia, these colonies, was just that you'll be able to draw your credit over there locally at your foot. Then when the Industrial Revolution comes, then you start making all these goods, say in Germany or especially in England, but they have to be transported. So the industrial, and America was like this too. You have to be, and so the Industrial Revolution had to find its own way of transporting stuff, and it invented the railroad, right? The railroad comes, now you can transport goods. You don't need the Roman roads anymore. Again, the railroad was invented first. Well, the Germans used it for moving troops between East and West, but ultimately in German unification, it became the big boost for the German rise as an industrial power. All right? And then after World War I, they invented the highway, okay? And now the internet to do all the banking, okay? So you go from coins, you go to pieces of paper. In my time, it was all paper, and now it's all plastic. Then it became plastic, and now it's not even plastic anymore. I just take my phone and wave it around a little bit, all right? Okay, so long story, but it's interesting, you know. If you read up on this history of banking, you can see this is all about the forces, the flow of momentum. This is all about the goods, you know, flow of physical goods, all right? There's two parts of the economy. We'll see with our bond graphs, we'll have two types of storage elements. C elements that store physical resources and I elements that store financial resources, okay? And then the mediation, space mitigates the physical resources, so by relativity, and bars and linkages, they transmit financial resources like a bank does by transmitting the force, okay? So I like to take a short break. I actually kept myself to the, oh no, I still need to do one thing, and then we can do, but I did want to give you guys this, this background. This is how credits and debits were developed, by the way. It was developed by, well, I'll talk about that after the break, okay? Zal ik op record drukken? Oh, goed zo. All right, let's, I just wanted to, I think in this, these terms, I wanted to stay a little bit more on this picture. I've decided just to tell you where the words credit and debit come from. So you have a, it feels a little bit artificial, but it was invented by these guys. They come from Latin words. Credit means from credere. They wrote in Latin, they spoke Italian. And debit comes from debere. So credere is to believe, like something is credible. And debere means to have an obligation. A debt is an obligation, all right? To have to, okay? So what would happen? How would they make the books? Well, what happened is, suppose you have a business, then the business has no money. So we're going to consider every element, every I element like a sort of a business, keeping its books. Like that, we can keep track of the credits and the debits. In order to get some money, what happens is the investor entrusts some money to the business, okay? That's the capital that comes into the business. So the trust, he gives some money in trust to the business. This idea of a trust is extremely, is very fundamental in medieval times. So when these crusaders went to hear the Holy Land, they had all these castles and lands, but they had to like do something with it, so they would entrust it to somebody to take care of it. So Richard Lionheart entrusted John to take care of his land in his lieu, right? So you had this idea that you had a rightful claim to property, but you could entrust it to somebody. So the Anglo-Saxon system still has this notion of a trust. So that's where this word credit comes from. So you entrust somebody, the business, with your money. That makes you an investor, all right? Okay. Now the business goes and buys some, with that money, they're going to buy some assets, some machinery or some wares that they got to sell somewhere over there. Huh? But they have an obligation to you. They have the debt to give you those assets back if you want your business. All right, they're yours. Now, any profit they make are also yours. So the agent will be acting for the owner in order to take care of the money entrusted to him, right? Huh? For all the debt and obligations. So this is to you. This is what is owed to you. This is what you loan to the business, and this part is what owed to you is coming back. So you can think of this as a money flow. The money flows from the creditor to the assets. The assets are the things that are owed to you, that you have. Debit is to have, right? Obligation. So you can see the flow of money or funds is going from a credit to a debit. Okay? In the same way, you can think of physical resources like you would do with the electrical analog of flowing from a seller to a buyer. All right? So these are where these words come from. And then if you say you sell something for cash, well, that has to flow out of your cash account. Now you buy something for cash, then you have to decrease your cash account. So you have to credit it because an asset is a debit balance, right? That's the stuff you owe to somebody. And you would increase your inventory account. So you would debit that, right? So it always flows from credit to debit, all right? So if you go back to, oops, could you reactivate my, so here I'd like to show that it would flow from credit to debit, from credit to debit, right? So this is how the money flows, right? So the goods flow this way. So you sell the goods, this is the seller of the goods, so they're out. But then the buyer, will come in and credit, the revenue account here, or the gross income, and then it will debit the amount of cash that comes in, so his assets go up, and then the bank would credit that again, and that's how it would flow, right? So accounting, like they did it, you see, these guys, it's called the Duality Principle, and they invented this double entry bookkeeping. So that for every credit, so everything that the owner owed, they would have something that is owed to the owner back, all right? And they just kept track of these two. And that's how they can extend credit here, because all you do is switch the ownership, all right? So, okay, now this is just the ownership, right? So then banking starts to work. So this is called double entry bookkeeping. These guys in these funny clothes, they just figured it out. But I think it was older, but they somehow, through the expansion of these trade networks and the need to transfer a huge amount of money, and because there was too little silver around to do so, they invented this. Of course, then they discovered, they invented the New World, and then all the silver came here into Seville, right? And then they had a lot more silver. They stopped paying with that, and you get this huge inflation, and the thing is blah, 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 right? But I think the lesson you have to see is that these guys were on the right track. There's a lot of people who think, well, what is the bank doing? I mean, it's just expanding the books, and the money is coming out of nowhere. And yes, it is coming out of nowhere. But it isn't really, because a momentum is in dollars per item. So it tells you just exactly how many dollars, every time you create an item, how many dollars of credit you create, and there's the same amount of debit, who you owe it to, Now, the conservation of momentum tells you that the flow of is the conservation of funds, in a sense. So the way accountants will talk about this, they consider finance as a closed system. So the money flowing in is equal to the money flowing out in any book, okay? And the flow rate, the amount of flow, that's just expanding the books or contracting the books, okay? So it's very important to see that money doesn't get created in the form of golden coins or anything, right? Gold has got really nothing to do with it, It's like it's just another good, and you fix it, price it, 1 florin, I mean. But it's totally symbolic, all right? Because as soon as you start importing too much silver, then your whole thing is going in the crapper. And secondly, if you don't have enough silver to ship around, you've got to do something else, all right? Okay? The other thing accountants do, they always put debit on the left side and credit on the right side if they make the books, when they journal things. So that's what I also do too, right? And I recommend you do too. You put all the credits on the right and the debits on the left, right? So here on the left are the assets, and here you'll see the equity and the liabilities. But you can also see asset accounts here, okay? So it's really not positive or negative, it's left or right or in and out, or that's really what it is, in and out. And this whole diagram here is just a way of relating plus and minus signs to credit money flow directions, okay? And that's arbitrary. I could have taken this the plus direction, that the negative direction. There's no difference, In the end, it all gets multiplied in power, and it will end up to be the same thing. But usually we think of the right as being the positive direction, and up being a positive direction, but we don't have to. Sometimes down is positive when we look at gravity, right? Okay? And here I've laid it out that positive corresponds to credit, which is on the right side of the book, so you can see this as a T. They call it a T account. You know now. So you see, I did quite a bit of work here to show you how accounting you can be viewed as just being a consequence of the flow of momentum, all right? And that you can fit it all in. At the same time, how the principle of relativity tells you who is a supplier of the goods and who is a demander of the goods, right? And this thing will tell you who is the creditor and the debtor. From these diagrams, you can see this is the long side, so this person is probably long. This is for the long, and this is the short side. You know, you can add it for more. Huh? And the long side is usually what they call the stockholder. They had these things also in the Middle Ages when there was no banking. For really primitive people, they would use these tally sticks. Maybe one day I'll talk about those. And then there was a bit of wood that they broke in two, and there was a big piece that was called the stalk, from the stalk of a tree, right? And a little piece that was called the foil or something else, right? But in any case, the stock was the one owning the goods, having the goods, or advance the money. So you could think of that as the long side, the stockholder, you know now. So I don't want to spend too much time on this right now because it's just so much to say. But suffice to say that all these terms like stockholder and debit, credit, viewed from an economic engineering perspective as a purely mechanical thing is very satisfying once you've figured it out. It's just kind of hard to do, okay? But once you've done it, you're okay, all right? Okay, any questions now about this business? Principle of relativity, across variables, flow variables. I had a small topic about, you see, this, and it came up last week again with Joris's work, and you got stuck on it. And I thought before leaving the subject altogether, it would be worthwhile just to quickly go through what's going on here, okay? So if you read Economists, starting from the patient zero, which is Adam Smith, all the way to today, you'll see that they'll have two types of goods. One are what they call consumer goods, and the other are what they call factors of production. This they also call factors of production, sometimes just factors. And we don't have two types of dimensions, right? We don't have X, Y, Z, or angles, or whatever. And it's good to just, at this point already, kind of establish what's going on here. How would we deal with that difference? Okay? Now, I just wanted to do that here. So this is a question of units and just a way you can fit things that are appear to be quite differently treated in economics, how they can all be treated the same in an economic engineering perspective. So the goods we've been talking about are what, you know, we're calling them commodities, but what we call normally consumption goods, okay? So apples, you know, and then we would use as units like the number of apples, so many bushels or pecks or whatever. Huh? And then the flow variable would, of course, be apples per unit of time. I use a day here for whatever reason. But you can go to commodity markets in Chicago and you can have pork bellies. These are not really consumption goods, you know. They get consumed by producers making sausages or whatever, right? Huh? Crude oil and that kind of stuff. So this could also be meters. So if you sold or if you traded like cloth, that would be measured in meters. Could be kilogram, you know, if you have so many kilograms of apples or so many pounds of ham or whatever. Huh? So I've just been using this as a sort of, you know, generic way of saying stuff, All right? Eh? Now, does that cover everything? No. There's a couple of things that I consider totally separate by economists, and there's 3 versions of them. Then trying to add some more to it, but these are the 3 classical things, and it's land, labor, and capital. All right? These are special in a sense. Because now, if you treated land like this, you would say, well, the land is just so many hectares, and the flow of land will be hectares per unit of time or so, will be flowing. It makes no sense at all, right? This thing is not flowing to you or to me or whatever, right? So these are also called durable goods. They are not consumed the way consumption goods are in one time. They actually yield some benefits over time, okay? It's like labor is that same way too, and the other thing that's the same way is capital. So suppose I have a piece of land. Do I really own the land? No, you don't. Actually, usually it's a lease, it expires, you know. What you own is so many years of usage of the land, okay? Now, this could be indefinite, then you've owned the land into perpetuity, but usually there's a time period set to it, okay? So if you rent a home, you will see that when you pay your rent, you buy only a week or a month, in your case, a month worth of that house, okay? So the units here are, I just used item days here. So if you buy labor, what you'll do is this will be, you know, man hours or something, huh? And if this is a car and I go to Hertz, rent a car, huh? Then it will be this car for so many weeks, okay? Now you can say to yourself, well, I bought a car so I can use all these weeks. Well, all you did really was buy, you know, purchase in advance a whole pile of weeks. You probably will have to deal with a Laplace transform to see the value of that, but the price is related to machine hours, okay? And if you're an accountant, you would book it that way. So suppose you have a business and you buy a piece of machinery or you buy even a car. You're not allowed to say that was an expense and deduct it that year. The taxman will force you, and also accounting rules will force you to write it off over a certain amount of years. And that's called capitalizing the asset, okay? So the real price you pay goes per year or per month or whatever the write-off is on this asset, okay? So what you're buying, according to the books you're making, your credits and your debits, is so many machine hours or man hours or years of usage of land, all right? So the stock variable has these units. Now, what's confusing about this? Suppose now you take the flow variable, right? Yeah. So why I then made this mistake, right? I don't know, huh? Because this should be then unitless.
But not necessarily, because you can set the stock variable to man hour, for example.
Yes.
But then take the flow of man hour per year.
Yes. That's what it really is, right? So you buy, you know, you have a flow of so many man hours per year. That's what you're buying. Uh-huh. That's what you're demanding. So this would be a demand for labor. Huh? So many man hours per year. Now you can do this per hour, and then you can cancel, so your demand will be measured in man. And you go like, oh, what's that? But this is what it is, right? And you can have demand for land, and the demand for land is measured in just land, hectares. If you go to what is his name, Valharian or something? Huh? Halvarian, yeah, Halvarian. He has a book called Intermediate Microeconomics. It's probably the most popular book right now. And he illustrates all of economics with an example, okay? And if you read that, there's chapter 1. What he has here, he has a demand line and a supply line, right? And here he puts apartments, because he thinks students can relate to that. And here he puts the price, but he measures the price in dollars per apartment month. Like a rent. Okay? So for him, the price is the rent. Okay? That's the price of the apartments, is the rent, not the purchase price. That's the value of the apartment. Okay? The price of the car is the rent on the car. It's called the rent. The price of land is the rent on the land. All right? So durable goods are rented, and the price is the rent, and non-durables are bought. All right? I should say capital goods. Okay? So here you can see he must have canceled this, right? So otherwise this will be apartment months per year, and then this will be something complicated, right? So dollar per apartment month per year, right? Huh? But they cancel these units. Huh? So take a look at that. The book is called Intermediate Microeconomics. It confuses the heck out of you until you realize that durable goods or capital goods are measured in another way.
Same with labor markets. They call the units, they call labor.
Yeah.
Then they call the price the
Wage.
rate.
Right. So on the labor market, this is labor in men or persons.
Yeah, just labor, units of labor.
Units of labor. And this is the wage rate. Yeah.
Actually what's going on is you have man hour per year.
Yes.
They call that labor. And then you have the wage rate, which is
man, dollars per man hour per year. Huh?
Dollars per man hour. Because man hour is the
Sorry.
the
Right. This is dollars.
But because it says man hour, they
Yes.
They have to call it a rate. It's not a rate, it's just wage, price.
That's how it works. And if you want to have machines, you just replace this by machine. Huh? And you replace this by, you rent a machine, right? Huh? Or capital. And you rent land. Okay?
And you drop the rate.
And what?
You drop the rate, the rent rate.
Yeah, so economists, they call it rates, but just because they see the dollar per machine hour.
Well, usually they'll call the surplus the rent. You know, this is the economic rent. We'll get to that, okay? And then they use this rate. So sometimes you'll call this the rental. There's a difference between, okay, you go around, you say, how much is the rent on this apartment? You say, so many, huh? And how much rent did I pay? We'll get to this after this slide, all right? Huh?
That's what we just call it, huurprijs.
The huurprijs, yeah, the huurprijs, yeah. The rental price. That will be the best way, huh? When we do the Laplace transform, we can get to what the purchase price is in this case, which is not a price at all, it's a value, right? Okay. So also shares on the stock exchange, they're capital, right? So what do you do when you want to evaluate? You're going to look at the earnings. I mean, what am I going to get? The dividends or retained earnings, you know? And of course, you can value it at 8 times earnings, and you can buy it, and the stock exchange will give you some number, so many dollars per share, but that doesn't mean that that is the price. That's just the value at which you're exchanging. We'll get to this, okay? Huh? It is a price, but not the price in the sense of Newtonian demand, okay? It's a different type of momentum. We'll get to this, all right? Just want to be sure that you get this difference. All right? So be careful your units. Now economists make a whole bunch of stuff. They have like production functions. So you'll have some goods coming out, you know, and they are a function of some capital goods like land or labor, huh? Say land or labor, huh? Or some goods, huh? And how can we view that? Well, you need to have two dimensions. So you'll have one, say, labor dimension, and then this other dimension will be those goods, products. This thing somehow is moving from labor is one dimension, right, to products is another one. Huh? Okay, but this could be another good. This could be some raw materials that you change in some product or doing something with it. Huh? Okay, so you'll have to use two dimensions then if you have a product and labor. You know, you'll have two Q's, Q1 and Q2, two velocities associated with that, two demands. So demand for labor and then demand for your products. Okay, so you'll have some kind of transformer. These are called transformers, right? Of course, you don't have to do that. You can go in the same direction. So this is a seesaw, and this will be just one good, and you know, this one goes a lot faster than this one does, right? So what would this be? Well, it's the same stuff. It'll be some sort of repackaging, you know? So you get stuff in huge amounts, like a wholesaler. This will be the wholesaler, I guess, huh? And this is the retail, huh? So the wholesaler is actually just pivoting like this. So he's just transforming. He's taking those big boxes and breaking them up in small ones, you know? And then he can decrease this dimension, decrease this, and increase this, or the other way around when you're packaging it. So this will be packaging, and this will be, you know, retailing. You know. So much for transformation, and so I did this transformation. So I just want to see that, yes, all this I element, we only did it for one dimension, but you can have multiple dimensions. You just need to use a gearbox or something to move from one dimension. You need an extra dimension, right? And you need some kind of gearbox to go from one to the other. We'll analyze these things further, okay? So with that, I want to end our discussion of Newtonian demand. And I have 50 minutes to start something entirely new, but I think will clear up a lot of stuff, okay? And I'm going to do this in the same way that the situation kind of was in mechanics. There was a huge confusion about what the notion of force was, and it was very polemic, with Leibniz on one hand and Newton on the other hand, both having a definition of force, and both claiming theirs was the only right one, okay? And we still have this situation with us today, and still many people are confused about the difference, okay? So we all know what Newton said. He says the force is this is force, right? Huh? There's a change in momentum. Huh? This is what Newton called the motive force. Force is vis, and motive is motilis, I don't know, in Latin. Huh? Maybe Emil knows what it is, or he just walked away. Huh? It's the motive force. This is what he called the motive force. But Leibniz said, no, that's nothing. I don't even understand what that is. This is my force. This is what Leibniz called the vis viva. I know this one. Huh? That means the active force. Huh? So he says that What is force? Well, look, I know what force is. I'm taking this thing, and I'm pushing it, and I'm dragging it over a meter, and then I know what the force is, okay? This is how I measure it. Huh? What do you mean time? Huh? He called this the dead force. Huh? And Newton stayed away from this. He didn't do anything with this. It was just lying around there. And it was a huge discussion about who was right. It turned out they were both right. Okay? But in a weird way, not in the way neither had anticipated. Okay? Now, you all recognize this, and you also recognize the problem, because I guess if I had asked you to give a definition of force, you probably would have done this, right? Just without knowing all this crap, right? Huh? This one is actually a little bit fuzzy to me, always. You know, well, this is the feeling I have with a force. Force is something that's required to move something over through some friction or something, okay? So it's not altogether clear to me what is the most, what's the most elementary. But anyway, we have both, right? So how do we reconcile this? How can both be right? How can both be forces? So we have two notions of force. We have this active force, and we have this motive force. This is the dead force. Now, we'll reconcile this, but the easiest way to do that is to immediately understand what is the economic equivalent of these two different things, okay? Now, demand by economists, if you look it up, it's defined as the willingness and ability to buy or sell, to buy, okay? The two words here, the willingness and the ability, right? This thing, we already know. That is your want over a time interval, dt, right? That's your willingness. But your ability is quite different, okay? That is your want as you've exercised it, or realized it by buying something, right? Another way of saying is you're fulfilling your want, right? So you have this want, and then you multiply. You can also see that as this. You multiply it by some goods. You're actually filling yourself up, So we say fulfilling the want, okay? We also say like we realize it. So we have this want. We're outside. Oh, I want to do this. I want to do that. I want to go to a party, but there are no parties, and I don't have any time, so I won't party, but I still want the party. But as soon as I realize that want, I fulfill that want to get the satisfaction, that's when I start getting the goods. So I would then multiply by the amount of extra of the goods that I got, okay? But when I'm just penting it up, to get my total willingness, I'm just moving along my demand curve, then I'm doing this, right? So Newton's motive force, that motivates me, and Leibniz's active force is what I start to do as real activity, okay? Now, an old word for activity, for power, was also the activity. It came from Leibniz's idea of the vis viva, okay? So economic activity, that is the satisfaction of your wants. So that is exactly fulfilling these wants, and that is done by multiplying by the flow of the goods, okay? In accounting perspective, a want is a credit. We know that, a credit or a debit, right? But it's a credit that has not been booked yet. It's what we call also an accrual. So you imagine you would book this credit if you did it, right? But once you take it and you make a purchase, then you booked it. It's called booking it, right? Huh? Why do they say book? Because these are these guys with that big ledger that you saw in Florentine, and they wrote it down. Pa, 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 pa. This has been done. Huh? First, you extend the credit. So this is the credit that's extended, and then he books it, you know, by buying the stuff. All right? Huh? So in accounting, you have this idea of realizing and unrealized capital gains, for instance. You know, so your capital got worth a little bit more, so you have this FDT, they call it unrealized. You know, and you can do an accrual booking. It's in Dutch is voorbooking. It's a booking you do before you do the real booking. And then when you sell it, that's when you can do the real booking. Then you realize this, okay? Now, what are the units? If you know that the units of F is in whatever currency per item per, I don't know, year, huh? And this DQ, the units are in items. So you see these fall off. Then the benefit, the one that you realize has, the items fall out because you've realized those, okay? This is the question you were asking, Rumer, okay? And now you just get these units of income, all right? Or revenue. That's the actual revenue that you book, all right? The actual credit that you book, and there'll be a debit that opposes it, all right? So there's some terminology that goes along with it. You can say that this thing is the want, this is the realizing this want, and this work is the benefit, that this is the little benefit, DW is the benefit received, so work is the benefit, all right? Huh? Then you can look at the rate of which this goes, and you can see this as being the flow of the goods. So you can see this as fulfilling this want. Okay, I guess that will be more V times F, all right? And then you get something that we call the power, but maybe this should be called in economics. You can also call it power. But if you have things like purchasing power, they're just not in these units, you know, so I find it hard. So I like to think of this as the economic activity, you know, now it's more general. The word power is not so great. This is an old word for power anyway. And then they switched to power because of James Watt, who wanted to sell his engine, and he wanted to have something really positive to say about it. So he came up with this word. He says, everybody wants power. It was a sales gimmick. And I want to talk in the future lectures a little bit of the history of power, and then why we have that name, because in Dutch we call it vermogen, which is certainly not a straight translation of power. Huh? Vermogen, that's like more like equity, you know, if you look at accounting.
Max, just a question. In the past, students have referred to power as growth.
Yes.
Is this also fit in this framework, or is that another different?
No, because what is this? This is energy, right? We're going to get to this. Huh? I want to show you that I want to now go to the work energy equivalence and then show you that it's the same thing. All right? Let's see what I did here. Yeah. So let's immediately answer very quickly Rumer's question. What has this got to do with growth? Okay? And then that will bring us to the surplus. And we won't have time to go through this, but we'll do this quickly, and then, you know, we're used to this. First get the ideas down, and then next week we'll kill them, all right? So this here, that's the benefit received. I'll just call this the marginal benefit, okay? So that was equal to a realized want, right? So this is the want, and you realize it, right? Huh? But this was the activity, right? So this is the power, right? So this is the period activity, right? But you know that according to Newton's law, this want here is equal to the negative of price reduction, right? So here I'm just using credit as debit, I guess. The credit is minus debit, right? So this want has to be financed in some way by either increasing or decreasing a price, okay? So here you use credit as minus debit, right? But then you know that P dot dt is equal to dP. So this is the quantity times, this is the price margin, this is the profit margin, and this is the quantity over which you're making the profit, okay? And there you go. Then you have, that's the dt, and this is the marginal surplus. Well, this is then the surplus or the profit, total profit. Okay? Now this is very quick. This is how you calculate, this is called the work energy principle, because this here is the kinetic energy, right? This thing here is a half divided by p squared. Okay, if you integrate, oh, wait a minute. If you integrate it out, that's what it is. I was going to do that here. But let's just bring this. All right, so let's just make a conclusion here so we can do this later. What I'm showing here is a response to what Rumer says. What has this got to do with anything, right? I don't know. What was your question?
It was specifically to economic growth. How does power related?
Yeah, right. So look at this. This is the marginal surplus, right? So this is the increase of the surplus or the profits, okay? This is a profit. Now, profits are economic growth, right? So this thing is equal to the power, well, it's right here. Okay?
How your books are explained.
Yeah.
Or how your GDP is explained.
This makes sense. We have to make the transformation.
But it can also be shrinkage.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Sure.
Or zero.
Yeah, that all depends on this sign. You know, credit is always going to be equal to debit. If you make this plus, this better be negative, right?
Yeah.
It all depends. Whether, you know, who is crediting and who is debiting, you know. But the true answer to this will come next week when we go through how to view this, you know. So here you see how they define producer surplus, right? So you will see this thing, we'll find this thing back. This is the kinetic energy. If this is a half mv squared, but this is the same. We'll talk about the difference, co-energy, energy, and this VDP is precisely this thing. It's a little bit of it, and then you can see when the kinetic energy grows in an I element, that's the same as the surplus growing. So you can think of power as a rate of growth.
Yeah, that makes sense. You.
Yeah.
And that combination of words, my head doesn't relate to growth.
The rate of. See, your wants are fulfilled, and how fast are you? See, your wants bring you to infinity. You want the sky. You want everything, right? So as you are fulfilling your wants, you're getting better, you're more wealthy, feeling better, more surplus. Okay? So you're increasing your income per year. The rate of increase of your income. Okay? We'll get to all of this. But for now, I want to see, you see, what you've just got to see is that the same, and then we'll get to a little bit of the history, how this was resolved and how it plays out. You know, this is actually how it was resolved, right? Through the work energy principle. Okay? But that these two, you see, one thing that I always find striking is that the problems they've had in mechanics are exactly the same as the problems you find here. For some reason, after I figured out what the resolution is in economics, to me, I finally can understand what the difference is in mechanics. to me, momentum and energy, in the end, are just strange concepts that I just have to learn what it means. But price and income, to me, are very clear, right? And a want and a realization of a want, or to me, are very clearly different things, okay? So we'll talk a lot about this. I think I should stop, huh? Okay? So it's a bit of a cliffhanger because this is a very interesting topic, but the other topics are also interesting with the banking and everything. So just an interesting topic, guys, huh? We'll see you then tomorrow, huh? For a short meeting, all right?
Can I ask a quick question?
Certainly.
If income is defined as dollars per year, or per month, choose something, I have defined it as dollars per year per household. Then you get this extra stock unit.
No, I mean, it's just household income.
Don't call it.
Yeah.
Don't call it something else. It's just, or the income density. So what you do, you can have the energy density. So you have a big vat, and you can look at the average energy per item, right? Huh? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So you could say that. All right. Huh? Okay.
Okay.
So you just look at a big box with all these billiard balls bouncing around, that each one has its own energy, and that's just what it is. It's so many joules, right? Huh? You could look at the energy density, so amount of energy per square meter or something, right? Huh? Or you can look at the average energy per ball or something, right? So just be sure that you keep, you don't just start calling it something different without saying a different word. This is the, income density, right? Huh?